Okay, let's get started. Let me know if you can't hear me in the back. Just to remind you where we were doing the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. And so we have a story about how much people buy on for the economy as a whole. That's aggregate demand, demand added up for all the people in the economy. And that looks like, so we have output, and here we're thinking about output as expenditure. And here we've got inflation, right? And the idea here is that we're going to look at how much people want to buy, and we're going to look at it as a function of inflation, right? Lots of things affect what people are buying, but we have a two-dimensional graph, so we can only pick one of those things. And so we're choosing inflation. It's probably not the most important thing that affects people, how much people want to buy, but it's the one that's part of our story here, the one that we're going to be making use of. Right? And so what we do is we come along and we say, yeah, this is aggregate demand, and this is supposed to be Y. And so remember, we can think of Y in any of three ways, or all of three ways. It can be expenditure, it can be income, it can be the stuff. Those are all the same for the economy as a whole. Here, we're thinking about it as expenditure, how much people want to spend. Right? And by people, we mean everyone in the economy and everyone who buys Irish products, so consumers, investors, government, foreigners, right? Our usual way of breaking it down. And what we do is we go in and we say, this is aggregate demand. Like you and me, we have no control over inflation, so we just take inflation as given, and we do the best we can. And that's the people in this economy. And so what we do is we ask, if inflation was 0, how much would people want to spend? And there's some amount, right? If inflation is 0, they would want to spend, say, this much. Oh, for goodness sake. And then if inflation is 5%, how much do they want to spend? And our story is that when inflation goes up, people want to spend less than when inflation is low. Okay? We have a bunch of reasons why that is, but we have our aggregate demand looks something like this. The higher we make inflation, the less people want to spend. Okay? So we're thinking about, we're changing pi, exchanging inflation, and just seeing how much people want to spend at each and every level. Right? And that's our usual C plus I plus G plus net exports. Okay? And we try everything. If inflation is 1,000,000%, how much do people want to buy? It has no basis in reality what this inflation is. We just try each and every possible level of inflation, see how much people want to spend. Right? And that gives us this curve, downward sloping curve. And then if anything changes other than inflation, we're going to have this curve shift. Right? So in particular, if autonomous spending changes, people become optimistic about the future and start buying more stuff. Autonomous consumption changes. Or if government spends more, if foreigners start liking our stuff more, that's going to shift this curve. Right? So if, for example, government spending goes up, then at each and every level of inflation that we pick, before government spending went up, we wanted to spend this much. Now we want to spend more. That amount plus what the government wants to spend plus whatever multiplier is going on behind the scenes. Right? And so we have a new aggregate demand curve, prime shifted to the right when G goes up, okay? Or any other autonomous spending. And in fact, this is also true of monetary policy. Right? If we increase the money supply, if money supply goes up, we know from before, the interest rate will go down, the price of money, and therefore, all right with the world, investment will go down, and so, investment will go up. Go away. Investment will go up, and it will have exactly the same shift. So if money supply goes up, we're going to have the shift going to the right as well. So all of our policy variables are going to be shifting aggregate demand left and right. And then we had short-run aggregate supply. And our story here, Y inflation. And now we're thinking about Y as output. right? The actual stuff produced. Remember, we can think about Y in any of the three ways. On our previous graph, we were thinking about it implicitly as expenditure. Here we're thinking about it as output, but we know in the end expenditure and output have got to be the same because income comes from producing stuff. The only reason that you're going to sell anything is if someone buys it, so income, expenditure, and output have to be the same. But here, for our story, we're thinking about it in terms of output. And here we're thinking about firms. So before, we were thinking about, well, for aggregate demand, we were thinking about people that want to buy stuff. People like you and me, but also firms that want to buy stuff. Also, the government wants to buy stuff. But now we're thinking about firms and how much they want to produce. So everything is about the firm's decision-making process here. Right? And our story is that there's some level of inflation that people expect. And we don't know where that is. Just like before when we were saying if inflation is this, what do people want to buy? If inflation is that, what do people want to buy? No connection with reality. We're doing a similar thing here. We're saying if they expect 0% inflation, what happens? If they expect 1,000,000% inflation, what happens? We're going to try each and every one of these expected inflations. But at the moment, here's our expected inflation. I picked one. Arbitrarily, completely out of the blue, I picked one. Right? That's what everybody expects inflation to be. And then, based on that, people are going to come up with contracts for input prices. They're going to come up for contracts for workers. That's going to give us the wage, the story we're always telling. But they're also going to come up with contracts for steel and contracts for jet fuel and contracts for all sorts of things that go into the production process. So they come up with contracts for wages. They set the wages based on this expected inflation. If expected inflation is high, they have high wages, expecting it to be eroded by inflation. If inflation is low, they have low wages, expecting it not to be eroded by inflation. But they're based on that. And then, after these contracts are set, then the actual inflation happens. And we don't know yet how that happens, right? But there's going to be some actual level of inflation that might be the same as what we expected, but it might be different as well, right? And so if we get the inflation that we expect, right, so if actual inflation happens to be just equal to expected inflation, no reason at this stage to think that that's true, but if it is true, then people are getting just what they expected. They expected 5% inflation. They built 5% wages increases into the contracts. And indeed, inflation was 5%. So everything is normal, right? If you're getting what you expected, this is normal. And everything is going to behave in the normal way. So we're going to get the normal level of output, whatever that is. And we have a name for the normal level of output, potential output. Right? It just means normal level of output, misnamed. But if we're getting the inflation we expected, we get the normal level of output, which is Y star. Okay? But if inflation is higher than we expected, we had 5% wage increases, but the price of everything went up by 10%. That's somewhere up here. Then it's really cheap for firms to hire the workers or to employ the workers, right? Because they have a 5% wage increase, but the price of their product went up by 10%. Their product is selling for huge amounts of money, and workers are relatively cheap compared to that. So they're going to hire more workers, and therefore they're going to get more output. Okay? So we're going to get some dot like this, more than the normal level of output. And if inflation happens to be, we don't know what it's going to be, but suppose it happens to be less than what we expected, then we expected 5% inflation. Everyone got a 5% wage increase, but the price of our product only went up by 2%, less than what we expected, right? Then firms are going to find workers very expensive because we thought we could sell 10 donuts to pay for an hour, but in fact we have to sell 15 donuts to pay for an hour. And so it's relatively expensive to hire workers in real terms, and so we hire fewer workers, therefore we get less output. We connect all those things up, and this is short run aggregate supply give n our particular level of expected inflation. Because I started all this by saying, suppose we expected this level of inflation. Completely pulled it out of the air, right? And so given that was correct, that what people expected, this is our short-run aggregate supply. But of course, we could have a different level of expected inflation. Okay, so in blue, we could also say, suppose, is that blue? It's bluish. A higher level of expected inflation. People expect inflation to be really high for some reason. We don't know why yet, right? They expect inflation to be really high. Then they negotiate their contracts based on that high level of expected inflation. And if they get the inflation they expect, then everything is normal, and they get the normal level of output. And if inflation is higher than expected, same story. Inflation is lower than expected, same story. So we get short-run aggregate supply given expected inflation prime. When we increase our expected inflation, this whole curve just shifts up. And if we decrease our expected level of inflation, once we renegotiate the contracts, the whole curve will shift down. So it's just going to, when we renegotiate our contracts, this curve is going to shift up and down, reflecting the expected level of inflation. So that if you get the expected level, everything is normal. You get the normal level of output, pi star, either y star, potential output. Okay. And then, once we had that, this is all old news, but it just helps to go over it. And then we put the two things together. And we said, here's y, and here's pi. We got aggregate demand, which is downward sloping. We got short-run aggregate supply. And let's say this is potential output. I can draw y star, y star. So this must be the expected level of inflation, right? Because the short-run aggregate supply is always going to be crossing y star at the expected rate of inflation. Or another way to say that, given the expected rate of inflation, if we actually get that level of inflation, we're going to get the normal level of output. So the way I've drawn it here, completely arbitrarily, is our actual output. If that could make it blue, that would be nice. Our actual level of output is here. And our actual level of inflation is here. Okay? The way I've drawn it. Okay? We have no reason yet to think that we're going to end up at potential output. We will do in a bit. But always in the short run, what's going to happen is we're going to be at the intersection of short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Okay? And now we want to move to the long run, which is the point of today's lecture. Yes, it is. And so we want to talk about what happens in the long run. Okay? That's where we were. Always, we're at the intersection of short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. The way I've drawn it here, that means we have a boom. Output is higher than potential output, and inflation is higher than expected. Okay? But if inflation is higher than expected, what that means is people are getting 5% wage increases, but actual inflation is 10%. So for workers, living is quite expensive. Still popular, but nonetheless quite expensive. Their rents went up by 10%, but their wages only went up by 5%. Right? And it wasn't because that was like some kind of clever negotiation or anything. They just got, surprised by inflation. I wasn't expecting inflation to be so high, wasn't expecting house prices to go up so much, and therefore I'm poor this year. Okay? And so what we're going to think is that if we were thinking about the long run, if we were thinking about what happens, like suppose this was the economy, and this was how the economy was, right? And nothing was changing. Nothing was like no shocks and no new politicians or anything, but this was just how it was each and every year. You can imagine that people make a wrong guess about inflation. Right? They think inflation is going to be 5%, it ends up 10%. And the next year after that, they think it's going to be 5%, but it ends up being 10%. And the next year after that, they think it's going to be 5%. It ends up being 10%. And each time, their real spending power is going down. Well, eventually they're going to cop on, right? If nothing else is going on in the economy, eventually they're going to say, I've been being fooled every year. Maybe I shouldn't be expecting 5% to be the rate of inflation. For the past 10 years, it's been 10%. Like maybe for next year, think about it being 10%. Right? So we can't be having our prediction of the long run of this economy being based on people being systematically fooled over and over and over and over again. Right? And if inflation, not this graph, but if inflation had turned out to be less than expected, the firms would be in that position. Right? They would be giving people 10% wage increases, but inflation is only 5%. And so their product is only going up by 5%, but their labor costs are going up by 10%. Again, they might be fooled for a few years, but eventually they're going to cop on and increase their expected inflation. Right? So one side or the other is being hurt by this if they're guessing wrong, and eventually that side is going to say, no, like the expectations were wrong, and they were going to update their expectations. So what we're going to do is we're going to say in the long run, and I don't know how long that long run takes, and we're going to discuss this at length, actually, how long this long run takes. But in the long run, eventually, we've got to be in a situation, or we've got to be at least heading towards a situation where people are guessing inflation correctly. And so if they're guessing inflation correctly, we're going to get output equal to potential output. Because if you're guessing correctly, everything is normal, and the normal level of output is what's going to happen. So our long-run aggregate supply is saying, I don't know how long that long run is or how we get there yet, but in the long run, if nothing is changing, in 1,000 years, I would expect people to be guessing inflation pretty well, right? If nothing is changing in the economy. And so in the long run, we're going to think that it's got to be that people are guessing correctly, right? If nothing else is changing in the world, obviously. Right? And so we're going to assume that in the long run, that we're going to get potential output. So if we draw, this is, yeah. So let me draw it. We have potential output here. Our long-run aggregate supply is this. In the long run, we're going to be on this vertical line. That is, in the long run, people are going to be guessing inflation correctly, and therefore we're going to get potential output. Okay. And so the idea here, well, one idea is, if we draw this thing now, I have another line to put in here. Y inflation, put in Y star. Long run aggregate supply. And let me draw it like this. Short run aggregate supply, aggregate demand. Right, so I drew this short run aggregate supply, so this must be the expected level of inflation. Right, because it must be, that's not it. That's not the expected level of inflation at all. Sorry. It must not be the expected level of inflation. Must not be. The expected level of inflation must be here. Right, because if we get the inflation we expect, we're going to get the normal level of output. But the actual inflation we get is here. Right, so. Ask Keynes, he said, your model is a very short-run model. No one can change their prices. Aren't you concerned about what's going to happen in the long run? And he said, in the long run, we're all dead, so why am I concerned about that? Right? So we are going to think that at any particular time, we're always going to be at the connection, at the intersection of short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. This long-run aggregate supply is telling us something about the long-run forces at work, but it's not telling us what happened right now. Right? Any particular moment of your life is the short run, right? Which is why it's so easy to procrastinate. You know that it would be good to do your work, but, you know, The tests are in the long run, and so it's so easy to watch more Netflix, right? We all know this, right? This is a fact of life. Or is it just me? It's probably just me. But yeah, it's the golden age of TV. I'm just telling you. So in the short run, we're always going to be on the short run aggregate supply. And this long run aggregate supply, you should think about, this is sort of the long run tendency of the economy to come back to this. Okay? So how do we see this? Well, how does this tendency to come back to the long run aggregate supply work? Well, if we look at this, we say, well, these guys here, they were expecting this level of inflation. So they built that into their wage contracts, right? They said, we're going to get 10% increases in wages. And the firm's not happy about it, but willing to give that because they expect the price of their product to go up by 10%. But reality kicked in, and we only got this level of inflation, right? And so actual output was this. We have a recession. So we got a recession. Output is lower than the normal level of output, lower than potential output. And people are not getting what they expected, right? They expect high inflation and they're getting low inflation. Now, it's great for the workers, at least the workers who keep their jobs, but it is because their wages went up by a lot and the price of products went up by a little bit. But it's terrible for firms, right? They gave 10% wage increases and the price of their product only went up by 5%. They're bummed out about that. So eventually, if this is really the situation, eventually people are going to change their expectation of inflation. It's got to be, like if I'm being fooled year in, year out, I'm thinking like this 10% expected inflation is not happening last year, it's not happening the year before. Eventually I'm going to think maybe 10% is too high, and I'm going to lower this expected level of inflation. Because it's all in my head, right? It's in my head how much inflation I expect, and if it's not happening year after year after year, I'm going to change that. And so the idea is if inflation is lower than expected, we are over time going to lower our expected inflation. Okay. Likewise, let me draw it again. Slightly differently. Here we got Y. Here we got pi. Here we got long run aggregate supply. Y star. Aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply. So this must be expected inflation, because if we get the expected inflation we expect, we should get potential output. So that must be where short run aggregate supply crosses potential output at expected level of inflation. But what we actually get is this. So here we have a boom. Inflation that we're getting is higher than the inflation that we expected. So our inflation that we expected determined our wage increases, right? We all went into the negotiation process expecting 3% inflation. We got 3% wage increases on average for the economy. Some people do better, some people do worse, right? And then, for whatever reason, actual inflation, when we see what actual inflation happens, we're way up there. And so actual inflation is 7%. We only expected 3%. And so prices of everything went up by a lot, but our wages only went up by a little bit. Of course, firms are delighted. They find workers very cheap because the price of their product went up by a lot, but their worker costs stayed low, right? But the workers, they're getting screwed by this because they expected 3% inflation, they got a 3% wage increase, but everything they buy went up by 7%. And so they're poorer than they were before. Okay? And if this was happening year in, year out, year after year after year, I'm getting 4% poorer, eventually I'm going to cop on and think maybe this 3% expected inflation is too low. We keep getting 7%, and I keep thinking it's going to be 3%. Eventually, we're not always quick on the uptake, but eventually we're going to figure out that maybe we're expecting too low of inflation because it's always 7%, right? And so over time, Maybe quickly, maybe slowly, we don't know yet, but over time, expected inflation is going to go up. Okay. I believe that's the next slide. Yeah. So this is just sort of summarizing that. If we have a recession, right, if output is less than what we expected, inflation expectations are going to come down over time, and that's going to shift down our short-run aggregate supply. And if output is higher than expected, that means actual inflation is higher than what we expected, then inflation expectations are going to go up, and the short-run aggregate supply is going to shift up. Okay. So here we go. We have it graphed out. Moving right along. So here I've drawn this thing. Right, here's expected inflation, and here's what we actually got, something less than what we expected. Okay. So one thing that we can wonder about is like, how did we get here anyway? How did we get to this point where we're getting something that's different than what we expected? Well, probably, but clearly we expected things to happen here, right? We expected this level of inflation. So we expected equilibrium to be here. But it's not. So it must be that aggregate demand is different than we expected, right? We must have somehow in our head had a thought that aggregate demand was going to be like that. But it turned out not to be that way, right? So we thought everyone was going to be buying stuff, but then something goofy happens in the US, or maybe we just get pessimistic about the future, and aggregate demand ended up being lower than what we expected. Okay? So, but here we are. We end up here, right? This is the aggregate demand we've actually got. People aren't buying that much stuff. This is the aggregate supply because we've already set our wage contracts and short-run aggregate supply. And so this is the actual inflation. This is expected inflation. This is the actual inflation, and we have a recession. Output is less than what we expected. Okay? Now, because output is less than what we expected because inflation is less than what we expected. And so we're expecting really high inflation. So something has to give, right? It can't go on this way forever and ever and ever. And you can think about it several ways, and they're all legitimate, and they're all different situations. One thing that you could think about is you could think that maybe people think aggregate demand is low for some one-time goofiness, right? Like the Americans have their current budget crisis going on, and so everything's in turmoil over there and nobody's buying Irish products. And so our exports are very low, and that's why aggregate demand is so low. But, you're delusional, but you might think that next year Americans are going to have their act together. Good luck with that. And we're not going to have this problem, and aggregate demand is going to go back, right? In which case, you'd keep the same expectations because you expect aggregate demand to go back, right? And that's reasonable, right? If you think it's a one-time thing that aggregate demand was so low, it goes back. But suppose it doesn't go back, right? Suppose aggregate demand stays where it was, and we were wrong to expect it to be up so high in the first place because the Americans haven't had their act together for ages. It's not like that's going to happen soon. And so aggregate demand is going to stay where it is. And we sort of slowly cop on that aggregate demand is going to stay down there. Something has to give. We can't keep expecting inflation to be high and have it actually be low year after year. And so what we're going to do is next time we're negotiating our contracts, we're going to say, well, maybe don't expect 10% inflation. Maybe expect 5% inflation. Lower your expected inflation, right? And there's a number of ways that we could do this. We could lower our expected inflation a lot. We could lower our expected inflation a little bit. Let me do a little bit. Let me just sort of arbitrarily do what's called adaptive expectations. That is, I expect I expect tomorrow to be just like today. So whatever inflation I get today, I expect next year's to be the same. Okay? That's one way that people could form their expectations. There's loads of ways, right? And this is one of the things that makes macroeconomics difficult in terms of policy, is that it's a lot of it's in people's head. Like where this short-run aggregate supply curve comes from, what level it is, depends entirely on what's in people's head, right? And so we have to figure out what's reasonable to think in their head. This is a nice place to start thinking about that. Okay? It's not the only place, but this is let's think that people think whatever happened today is going to happen tomorrow. Okay? Not unreasonable, particularly if you're not a professional macroeconomy watcher. Right? We had 5% inflation this year. I expect 5% inflation next year. Okay? I know I might be wrong, but it's a good place to start. No? Okay. So suppose that's what we do. So our initial expected inflation 0, was this. Actual inflation in time 1 was that. Or it's expected inflation in time 1. It's what we expect in time 1. It's not what we got. And so when we go to the future, we say, well, we think the future is going to be like today, so my expected inflation in time 2 is going to be this level that we got today. Right? So if that's true, well, if we go into the negotiations like that, and everybody does, then we're going to get this new short-run aggregate supply. With expected inflation expected equal to time 2 equal to the actual inflation in time 1. Okay. That is, our short-run aggregate supply is going to be shifting downward so that we have it crossing potential output at that level with our new expected inflation. Right? Which means in the next period, what's going to happen? Well, we're going to be at the intersection of short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And so Y2 is going to be here. And actual inflation 2 is going to be here. So we still have a recession. We're still below potential output. But it's less of a recession than there was before. We've lowered our expected inflation, but inflation is lower than that as well. Okay. And we could keep doing this. It would be very messy. Let me do it on the next page, just to sort of. So I'm just redoing what we had over there, and I'm trying to make it as clear as my poor little handwriting can handle. Here we've got our Y star, vertical line, long run aggregate supply. We've got our initial short run aggregate supply. So this must be our initial expected inflation in time 1. Okay. At the dawn of time, we expected that to be what inflation was. So we must have been expecting aggregate demand to cross here. Right? But in fact, it did not. It crossed here. And we are supposing that it's going to stay put. And so what we ended up with was this was actual inflation in time 1. It was less than what we expected. Right? So we have our initial Y1 is less than potential output. And then because we supposed adaptive expectations, we didn't have to. Like there's lots of ways expectations can be formed depending on the situation. But we assumed adaptive expectation because that's a nice way to start. People just expect tomorrow to look like today. Right? In that case, in the next period, this became the expectation for period 2. for the next year, right? Which means we get a new short-run aggregate supply. Let me do this in green. Short-run aggregate supply for period 2. If we end up getting the inflation that we expected, we're going to have the normal level of output. Okay? But in fact, we don't. We end up with Y2 here. And the actual inflation ends up being here. Okay? So our recession has gotten better, right? Output has gone up, but it's still not up to the normal level of output. Right? And we've lowered our inflation expectations to what it was yesterday, but in fact, inflation is still less than expected. Okay? The gap has gotten smaller. And so if we go to the next period, which we'll do in purple, then expected inflation. Expected inflation in 3 is just the inflation that we actually got in period 2, right? Because we assumed that the inflation expectations work this way. Okay? So if we get what we expect, we're going to get potential output. So our new short-run aggregate supply looks like that. Okay, we're just shifting down over time. And the inflation that we actually end up getting is this. And likewise, output is this. So in each period, our recession gets better, we're still in a recession, but it's slowly going away. Our inflation expectations keep coming down, but actual inflation keeps coming down even more. Right? And so we're just sort of getting closer and closer together on inflation and inflation expectations. Our short-run aggregate supply keeps shifting down. Our output keeps getting closer and closer to Y star. And where's all this going to end? Well, we have one of these infinite series. It's never literally going to end. But clearly, in the infinite future, if I do this in blue, in the infinite future, it'll go over to here. Short-run aggregate supply, well, infinity. I can't draw a great infinity. But the short-run aggregate supply is going to keep shifting down, keep shifting down, keep shifting down until it eventually gets to here. In the infinite future, little by little by little by little. And this is sort of the long run. And then we will be getting the inflation that we expected. Right? We sort of carry this out. This is expected inflation in the long run, which is equal to actual inflation in the long run. And this is Y in the long run. Okay, infinite future, distant thing. The short-run aggregate supply keeps shifting down. As long as we are guessing inflation wrong, we're going to keep shifting our expected inflation. That's going to shift short-run aggregate supply down, and it's going to keep going down until we eventually converge on the point where all these 3 lines match. Short-run aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand are all crossing in the same bit. Okay. This is what's called, at least in the book and in many places, the self-correcting nature of the economy. That we go into a recession. If you don't do anything, if the government doesn't do anything, makes no policy response at all, eventually you're going to get out of the recession. Right? People are going to eventually shift their expected inflation down, and this is going to lower short-run aggregate supply until we're back at potential output, and you're getting what people expected. So you had this recession. Initially, you had this Y1, which was way below potential output. If you wait around long enough, that's going to fix itself. Glorious, glorious. Okay? Now, the question is, how long is that? Well, it's in the long run, right? And in the long run, we're all dead, so why are we going to wait for this? And so there's various thoughts on how fast this process is likely to go. Okay? And so this is what I keep coming back to, how we're forming our expectations. This matters a lot, right? It is reasonable to think that maybe people don't adjust their inflation expectations at all for a while, right? Right? They think this is just a one-off. Aggregate demand is down low, but it's going to bounce back. And so it could be years before we even start this process. That's reasonable. Depends on what people are thinking and why they're thinking it. Right? How do they come up with these initial expectations in the first place? Right? If you think if aggregate demand is going to go back up, you wouldn't want to lower your inflation expectations because you expect, yeah, today's inflation is low, but tomorrow's is actually going to be really high because aggregate demand is going to come back. And so when you're negotiating for your wages, you do want to take that into account, the fact that you think aggregate demand is going to bounce back. In my little story, I said, no, it didn't bounce back. But maybe it does in reality. It depends on why we had this aggregate demand low in the first place. Right? And then we could have these adaptive expectations where we just slowly work it down. We could also say, I kind of think that it's like that, but I think most people think the aggregate demand is going to bounce back. Okay? And if most people are thinking that, short-run aggregate supply is actually going to be really high. Even though I think inflation should be low, it's going to be lower, everyone else thinking it's going to be high, I'm still going to think that we're going to have high inflation, just because everyone else is delusional. What can you do, right? And so there's no reason that it has the inflation expectations too has to be this low. It could be up here, just depending on what's in people's heads. On the other hand, we could go to the other extreme, and we could say, this is just an introductory macroeconomics model. Lots of people have taken introductory macroeconomics, and those that haven't can probably read the newspaper written by somebody who has. And so everybody knows that in the long run, we're going to be over here. Right? Everyone knows it. They took the module. Everything's great. Not everyone's a great student of macroeconomics, but some people, they can ask their friend, well, how does the model work? And they say, we're going to go right back down here. And so we could jump right to there, right? Because instead of doing this adaptive expectations where we think tomorrow is going to be like today, we could say, no, we're going to assume that nobody gets fooled. We're going to look for an equilibrium. I'm wondering, what's tomorrow going to be looking like? And people getting systematically fooled when they know the model, that can't be right? Because in period 2, people are expecting high inflation, but they're actually getting low inflation. They should know that this kind of expectations is dumb. You're going to get fooled. They should take that into account. And so they should say, let's look for a place where I'm not getting fooled. And the only place where that is, given that aggregate demand stays where it is down here. So maybe they immediately go here, right? Because they know the model, and they're not stupider than economists, like few people are. And so if we know it, they should know it too. And so that's what's known as rational expectations, that people take all the information in the model and use that to form their expectations, not just tomorrow is going to be like today. That's dumb. We know more than that, right? And they should know more than that too. And so they'll use all the information of the model. We're not more clever than them. If we know it, they know it, and they're going to just jump right there because it's in their head, right? And if what they have in their head is this model, and they don't want to be fooled, that's the only place where they don't get fooled. So they should just jump right there. And so we can easily see that this lowering of inflation expectations could be really fast. It could be really slow. Okay? And so people that think that maybe the government should get involved, maybe we should increase government spending to get aggregate demand to go back, or maybe we should increase the money supply to get the interest rate to go down, to get investment up, and get aggregate demand to shift right and go back to our thing. Because we could have solved this just by shifting the aggregate demand curve, which we can do with our policy tools. Right? And so if you think that this whole process is going to take years and years and years and years, and we're going to have unemployment for ages, and we're going to have a wasted decade, maybe policy intervention would be a good idea. Okay? On the other hand, if you think that this is going to be really fast, and everyone's going to adjust their expectations really fast because they know the model, and maybe it's not going to be instantaneous like that, but pretty quick, then you'd say, well, if we get involved and start shifting aggregate demand around, we're just creating problems. People were solving these problems quickly and easily on their own. It's going to take a year. Everything will be back to normal. If we start mucking about with it, we're adding uncertainty. We're adding reasons why they might screw it up. Whereas economy is self-correcting. If we think it's going to self-correct quickly, leave well enough alone and just let it self-correct. And so there's very different sort of policy recommendations if you think that this is a slow process versus you think that it's a quick process. Okay? And it could be either in principle. Now, one of the things that Keynes said is like, it's hard to get people to reduce their wages. So the prices are sticky downward. It's hard to get people to lower their wages. And so it could be difficult to go down. But it also could be quick. Like there's nothing in theory to say that it should be quick or it should be slow. Right? It depends on how you think people, how sophisticated you think people are. And not only how sophisticated you think they are, but how sophisticated you think they think other people are. Right? So if I think it's going to go back down to the long run really quickly, but I also think that other people are idiots and they're going to keep their expectations high, then that's not smart for me to think either. Right? And so it could be a very long process to go down. And so lots of the debates in macroeconomics are about how quickly do we think this process is going to happen. Okay? And that's very different policy recommendations. If we think it's slow, maybe we should intervene. If we think it's fast, we should leave well enough alone. Okay. All right. Let me do the same thing in reverse. Well, in reverse for a boom. Drawing it big once again. Y. I'm going to put potential output over here. This is long run aggregate supply. This is Y star. I'm doing that just to give me lots of room on the right to work because we're going to be having a boom. Right? And I'm going to put short run aggregate supply over here. And I'm going to put aggregate demand. We'll do it in blue again just to, apparently aggregate demand should be blue. Okay, so this is our initial situation. So it must have been, right, because we have this short run aggregate supply, it must have been that people thought this was the expected level of inflation. We thought that was what's going to happen, so we built that into our wages. And then for some reason, aggregate demand ended way up here. So aggregate demand is way higher than we expected. Okay. Yeah. Can happen, right? People can all of a sudden get optimistic about the future. There could be a new wave of Irish pub building and everyone's buying our stuff, right? People like Irish products, or there's a boom if people come optimistic about the future. Whatever reason, this was unexpected, and now output is higher. The purchases, aggregate demand is higher than what we expected, and therefore, we don't end up in equilibrium here. We end up all the way over here. This is our actual output in time 1, and this is our actual inflation in time 1. Right, we expected inflation to be this, but it ended up being that. Okay. Moving over to green. So again, if we think that people have adaptive expectations, right, then, and no reason why they should, but it's a nice place to start, right? If we think they have adaptive expectations, then this will be their expected inflation in period 2. Right? This is assuming they're not sophisticated, they don't know the model, they're not macroeconomists, and they think everything is going to stay stable, right? Which the model says it won't, but they, for some reason, think it would. Right? In that case, that would be their expected inflation, which means if they get that inflation, here we have a boom, right? They get that level of inflation, everything is normal. So this is, carry it out, short run aggregate supply 2. This becomes the level of output in time 2. And this is the actual level of inflation in time 2. Right. So the whole short run aggregate supply curve shifts up. Output comes back down, and inflation keeps going higher. Right. We had high inflation before, now it's even higher as we adjusted our inflation expectations up. But our expectations and the reality are closer together than they were before. Even though inflation is higher, they're coming together. So our boom is self-correcting as well. Right, now, first we had a huge boom, and then it's scaling back. Again, the self-correcting nature of the economy. Leave it alone, Eventually, as people's expectations adjust and they renegotiate their wages, that's going to lower the boom. Okay. But of course, we're still being fooled, right? So if people are really sophisticated, they wouldn't have expected this in the first place, because even there, they're still going to get fooled. Inflation is going to be higher than they expected. So if they were super sophisticated, they would think this level of inflation, which is the long-run level of inflation, was it. They would just jump there, right? Rational expectations. But not in our little story. In our little story, they got their adaptive expectations. So this inflation that they got in period 2 is going to be equal to their expected inflation in period 3. And if everything is normal, they're going to get the inflation they expected. So they're going to have this short-run aggregate supply in period 3, again, shifting up. That is going to lower output, but still not back to potential output. Our boom is getting smaller, but it's still there. And actual inflation is going to be higher still. Right? And eventually, we're going to get closer and closer to this point. Our short-run aggregate supply is going to keep shifting up. Every time we're fooled, it's going to shift up some more. That's going to lower the boom, self-correcting nature of the economy, and increase inflation. That's going to keep happening until we're all the way up here, where this is short-run aggregate supply in the long run. This is Y in the long run. And this is inflation in the long run, and also expected inflation in the long run. So eventually this thing is going to get closer and closer to being stable, and eventually, all the way go to the long run. But again, that could happen immediately as well if people expected it to, right? If people knew the model and expected everyone else to know the model, not only do I know the model, but I know that you know the model, and I know that you know that I know the model, and I know that you know that I know that you know the model, and so on and so forth. And if anyone took game theory? No? Okay. There's a lot of that going on in game theory. It's all very Princess Bride. But if that's true, then we would jump to the long run equilibrium right away. Right? Reality, almost certainly somewhere in between, right? There's one thing where they don't change their expectations at all. They expect aggregate demand to come back. And in principle, that could go on for quite a while. Right? You can think, it didn't come back last year, but it's coming back next year. Didn't come back. It can't go on forever, but it could go on for a while. Right? So we don't even have to have this self-correcting thing kick in immediately. It doesn't have to be that your expected inflation is just equal to today's. It could be something more sophisticated, less sophisticated. But eventually, inflation expectations have to adjust. Given that aggregate demand doesn't come back, inflation expectations have to adjust, possibly incrementally, possibly slowly, until the economy corrects itself. Okay, so everyone agrees it's self-correcting in this way. It's huge disagreements on how fast it is. And you say, oh, it's an empirical question. Let's just look at how fast it takes. Right? That seems fair. And if you do that, you'll find it takes different amounts in different times, because people have different things going on in their heads at different times. And so there's no one answer to this. Like, it's not, this is how it works, because again, it's going on in people's heads. And it depends on why they think aggregate demand was low. It depends on what they think policymakers are going to do in response to that. So far here we have policymakers doing nothing. But of course, policymakers in real life might do something. And people are going to take that into account as well. So it's all well and good to say we have these different things, but what you need to know is it's nice to be able to track that out, because it shows whether you understand the graphs, right? But it's also important to realize that this can be a very slow process. It can be a very fast process. We could jump there. We could not move for ages. But eventually, in the midst of time, midst of the future, the economy has to fix itself, right? Inflation expectations have to adjust, because having them be off, having the actual thing be different from what we expected, means that someone is getting really hurt. Either the firms or the workers getting really hurt. They are eventually, maybe not so fast, but eventually going to cop on, and inflation expectations will adjust. As they adjust, short-run aggregate supply is going to shift, and that's going to eliminate, in this case, the boom, or if we're in a recession, that's going to eliminate the recession. Okay. Okay. What else do we have here? Yes, yeah, this is, I'm just doing what I did, right? So this is neater and cleaner graphs where we short-run aggregate supply. In this case, we have a boom initially. Eventually, it's going to shift up. Okay. So here is an example previous exam question. And I put this up here because a lot of people struggle with identifying theory questions. Like, how do I know what model you're talking about? First of all, we'll have like reviews and all, but we don't have that many models. I know all your heads are swimming and they just seem like lines up, lines down, going all over, but we don't have too many. So the first thing you do is say, starting from long-run equilibrium, if G goes up, what happens? This is the question. And we're going to have a whole bunch of things, and if you read them all, you'll get dizzy. I know I do. Output inflation will go up permanently. Output inflation will go up temporarily, but then go back down. Output and inflation will go up, but then output will go down, and then inflation will stay there. Output inflation will go up, but then output will go back down, but inflation will go even higher. Output will go up, and inflation will go down temporarily, but then they will both return to the original. Are you dizzy yet? I'm dizzy. Right? So there's a bunch of stuff. And so our first job, as we read a question, is to say, is this a theory question, or is this an empirical GDP accounting sort of question? Okay. Well, it's all about predictions, right? If G changes, what's going to happen? Right? And so that is a question about understanding how the economy works. So that is definitely a theory question. Right? It's not, how do I calculate GDP from this thing? It's saying, I want to make a prediction about what's going to happen to the economy. And so for that, we need to understand the economy, and theory is how we understand the economy, right? Or how we attempt to understand the economy anyway. So I have a theory question. Now I have to identify what theory it is. Oh, God help us. Right? Okay, what did we have? We had the Keynesian cross diagram thing. We had money supply, money demand. That pretty much covers it, right? And we got this model, right? And so you have to know a little bit to identify what model we're talking about here. But we do know that the Keynesian model and the money supply, money demand model are short-run models, right? We're fixing prices. We say, barbershop posts his price, and people just decide whether to go in or not. So there's no sense of time in that. And here, all of our answers are about permanently, temporarily, and then this happens, and then that happens. And so these are all very much time-related models. And the only model we have so far that has anything to do with time is this short-run, long-run aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. Right? So we just sort of looking at the question. It doesn't say, sometimes they say what model they're in. Oh, ISLM as well, but they were just built on those other models. Right? They were really sort of a fancied-up way of talking about those other models. So again, static model, like all in short run. So here, this is our only model that talks about any of this stuff. So even though it didn't tell us in the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, we can still figure out that one has to be a model, and two has to be that model, because that's our only model that talks about time, like what happens now versus what happens later. The only one we've got. So we've identified the model. And now we're going to start from long-run equilibrium, and we're going to figure out what happens when G goes up. So let's do that. Let's do that. All right. The other thing is when you get a model question, you are expected to draw the graph. Right? Sometimes there's a graph provided for you, and you can play around with it. But the graph is there to help us think. Right? And you're expected to think, so you're expected to use the graph. Use the back of the sheets, use a blue book, whatever. You're supposed to get out a piece of paper and do the graph. Got plenty of time, loads of time on these exams. Do the graphs. That's what they're for, right? They're to help us think. So we're told, here we got our Y. Here we got our inflation. Oh, the other thing that we could see from this is there was lots of talk about inflation and output, right? Inflation, output, output, inflation, output, inflation, output, inflation. And this is our model that talks about output and inflation, right? We never talked about inflation in any of the other models. Here we're talking about inflation, so this is also a way to identify the model. Okay, and we're told that we're starting in long-run equilibrium. So we have Eventually, I'll make the technology work. Long run aggregate supply, right? And we're going to have, obviously, a short run aggregate supply, Y star. And we're told we're in long run equilibrium, so all three of these lines must be crossing at the same spot. So I can draw it. Here's our aggregate demand, initial. And then we are told that government spending goes up. So always these things are, like the way models work best is you start in equilibrium, something happens, and then you trace out the effect of that thing happening. Right? So starting in long run equilibrium, we were told that. We weren't told that aggregate demand was so squiggly at the top end, but maybe it is, I don't know. I don't know its shape other than it's downward sloping. So squiggly is fine. We're told that government spending goes up, right? And we're supposed to initially identify, like, who does this affect initially? Is it the spenders or is it the producers? Because aggregate demand is the spenders, short-run aggregate supply is the producers, the firms. Right? Well, it's spending, so clearly it's a spender. Right? If government spending goes up, there's more spending, and our whole curve shifts to the right with government spending going up, which means we're in a new short-run equilibrium. This was expected inflation. Right. And so we were in long-run equilibrium, and it was also our initial level of inflation. This was our initial level of output. So output initially went up, and inflation initially went up. So if we go back to our things, A is possible because both of them went up. So that's still possible. We don't know what happens in the long run yet, but we're okay. Output inflation will go up temporarily, possibly this. Output inflation will go up, possible. Output inflation will go up, but then that's possible. Output will go up and inflation will go down. Right? So this is wrong. Our initial pass. As we saw, inflation went up. Okay, so we can eliminate E. Okay. But we don't know anything about A, B, C, or D yet. So we need to find out what happens next. Right, so we have output and inflation initially go up, but we know that this is not long-run equilibrium, right? Because output is higher than potential output. Inflation is higher than what people are expecting, so eventually they're going to change their expectations. So in the long run, people will change their inflation expectations so that they are getting the inflation they expect. And that is way up here. Short run, aggregate supply, long run. So that inflation expectations in the long run are equal to actual inflation in the long run. Right? So eventually, maybe quickly, maybe slowly, our short-run aggregate supply is going to shift up to there. So if we're to ask what happens permanently, well, it's going to be in the new long-run equilibrium, right? So what happened between our initial thing, inflation went up even more, and output went back down. So our initial effect is output and inflation go up, and then in the long run, inflation gets even higher, and output goes back down. So we go back over here. Output and inflation go up permanently. That's not true. In particular, output goes back down. Right? Output inflation will go up temporarily, but then go back down. That's not true because inflation doesn't go back down. Output does go back down, but inflation does not. Output and inflation will go up, but then output will go back down, but inflation will stay there. This is kind of iffy because it actually goes up farther. But if that was the only one that had this, that could be a best answer, right? So it's not wrong. It's sort of for some definition it stays there, but this is true. But probably there's a better answer. Okay? So you need to read all the answers, right? Output inflation will go up, but then output will go back down. Check. But inflation will go even higher. So D is better than C. So D is our correct answer. Okay? So what do we get out of this? You see a theory question, you take a deep breath, you first ask yourself for any question, is it theory or is it measurement? If it's theory, you try to say, well, if it tells you what model, great. But if it doesn't tell you what model, you try to figure out from context, from the answers, from the question, what of our, like in the end, we're going to have 4 models for the 5 models maybe for the entire thing, and you identify which one of those it is, right? And then you are meant to draw the graphs. Even if the graphs aren't provided for you, you are meant to draw them on a piece of paper and figure out what happens, right? It is silly to try to memorize all of that. That's what the graphs are for, to give you the answer, right? And so use the graphs. Right. What else do we have here? Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to do a break because I'm going to do it just a little bit more and then I'm going to let you go. So another 10 minutes. And so we're getting towards the end and we're doing okay on time. So I think 2 hours, like people's brains shut off after an hour or maybe after 40 minutes. I don't know. But 2 hours is long. So we'll cut back on the 2-hour days just so that your end of semester isn't too grim. Other thing we can ask is, why do we get recessions? Why do we get inflation? Where is it coming from? And there's fundamentally, in this, like if we expected things correctly, right? If we can correctly predict inflation, then we're going to have no recessions. We're going to have no booms. Everything's going to be normal, and we're going to have a certain level of inflation, and we're going to get potential output, right? We're going to be in that long-run equilibrium. So it must be that to get off of that, something unexpected happens. Right? Whatever happens, as long as we're expecting it correctly, we're always going to be at potential output. But the fact that we're not always at potential output in real life is really telling us that unexpected things happen. And I don't think you need to take an economics course to know that sometimes in life unexpected things happen. Right? All copped onto that by the time you're 18. Right? Unexpected things happen all the time. And it happens in the economy as well. And so there's 2 sort of ways that we can think, or 2, like this is another huge argument in macroeconomics. Like where does uncertainty in the economy come from that drives everything? And one, sort of the Keynesian model, and this is basically a Keynesian class, so it all comes down to demand shocks. People are unable to perfectly anticipate aggregate demand, the amount that people want to buy. Right? And so, people get pessimistic about the future, they cut back on consumption. They become optimistic about the future, they consume more. They become optimistic about the future, investment goes up. They become pessimistic about the future, investment goes down. For whatever reason, all of a sudden, foreigners start buying Irish products or they stop buying Irish products. All these things can shift aggregate demand around. And these are called demand shocks. Right? Demand, because they're affecting how much people want to buy. And shocks because they're unexpected. Right? I'm shocked. But it was something that we didn't build into our inflation expectations. Right? So if we, this is so unhelpful. Yeah, so here, if we're starting in long-run equilibrium and we have a demand shock, aggregate demand, if people start buying Irish products, well, that means that all of a sudden we expected this level of inflation, but aggregate demand ended up here. And so inflation is higher than what we expected. Output goes up. And this is that story about where booms come from. Right? And of course, left to its own devices, short-run aggregate supply would eventually go up. Or, depending on why we had this demand shock, whether it was a one-time thing or something that's likely to stay around, maybe aggregate demand goes back down. And so maybe people don't adjust their inflation expectations. Okay. Now, there's a whole, this is just so that you know what exists in the literature. There's a whole nother school of thought, and it is a large one, that talks about supply shocks. That is, firm costs. All of a sudden, oil prices go up, and it's more expensive for firms to do stuff. The book goes on for a while about supply shocks. I will say that you are not supposed to look at supply shocks for this class. Just don't look at it. Just the same way you don't look at the central bank reaction function, don't look at supply shocks. This is not because they're unimportant, but because this is not the most useful model to look at them. And the reason is because a supply shock, a change to firm costs, shifts firm decisions, right? So it's something about firm decisions, that if you shift firm costs, it's going to affect them first. So we're going to have shifts in aggregate supply based on things that happen to firm costs. Right? Fair enough. But it's very hard to tell a story. Like, it's very hard in this model to be clear about which things are only going to affect short-run supply and which things are going to affect long-run supply as well. Right? You can do it, and the book tries. Right? Authors are nuts, but they honestly try. But if I ask any question, it's always going to be a little ambiguous. You could tell a reasonable story that anything changes long-run aggregate supply or doesn't change long-run aggregate supply. You get totally different answers different ways. So it's an important area of economics, and because it's important, the book tries to talk about it using this model. But like the people who think that these supply shocks are important would never use this model. It would have models designed to tell that story. This model is not well suited for telling that story because it's very hard to disentangle long run and short run, other than like sort of telling you, does it affect long run for some reason? I don't know why, right? So we're not doing that. So like cross it out, throw it out. Read it if you want, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. But do be aware that that's an important way that people think about where recessions come from that we've not been covering in this class. Okay. That's all I've got on this. I will let you go. And on Tuesday, we'll start our last section, which is on the Phillips curve, which is just this model looked at it in a different way. Okay. Have a good weekend.